Hello and welcome to Elimination Exchange, a podcast hosted by the Global Institute for Disease Elimination, or GLIDE, based in Abu Dhabi. In this podcast series, we explore topics related to disease elimination efforts, specifically infectious disease elimination, and current priorities in global health and the development agenda. In today's episode, we'll explore global health security, thinking about pandemic preparedness and response and surveillance. And I'm really excited to be joined here today by I Eloise Todd, who is Executive Director and co-founder of Pandemic Action Network, or PAN. Eloise, welcome. It's so nice to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Priya. It's great to be here.
We'll get right into it. I think we have a lot that we want to talk about and cover, and as always, never enough time. But first, wanted to give you a chance just, to introduce yourself and a little bit about the Pandemic Action Network for folks who may not be familiar with the network.
Sure. So the Pandemic Action Network sprung into life in March, April 2020. And it was really a group of like-minded souls that found each other across space and time that were worried about the world's reaction to COVID, or rather lack of reaction, and the impact on low and middle-income countries in particular. And it felt like civil society voices were not enough part of the debate. And so we created this forum, this virtual online forum in those days of lockdown, to bring together as many voices from as many parts of the world as possible to say, hey, if you're interested in advocating towards your government for policies that are going to keep people safe and be equitable across the world, come on in and we're going to bring in the expertise to help get there. And so that's what we did. And we launched with 25 partners in April 2020. We're now really proud to have over 400 partners around the world, including around 100 in Africa. And the Africa piece is a really important part of our work. And so we try to do the same thing. Obviously, we've moved from the COVID response, those heady days of the intense response effort, to an effort that's really about, can we get governments preparing in order to prevent pandemics in future and to make sure that preparedness is top of the agenda? That's very hard in the current global environment, but that's what we're working to do. And we're really proud to be partners of GLIDE, who have been brilliant partners with us on that journey.
Thanks so much, Eloise. I think we joined the Pandemic Action Network sometime in 2021, and it was sort of year one of GLIDE even existing. And so we were so young, and it felt really exciting to be part of this movement. I think it's been a long time since civil society is young, strappy, and hungry to start like this. So it's exciting to see where the network has come to in the past 4 years. And I think, your introduction leads us really well into this conversation here and the threat of infectious diseases on global health security. Could you talk to us a little bit about that and sort of that connection? Obviously, we've seen that interplay in the last few years, specifically with COVID-19, but I know that the Pandemic Action Network is looking beyond as well, and some sort of the reaction and interplay between infectious disease and global health security.
Sure. And thanks for that question. I think there's the ongoing efforts that we have to tackle disease threats that have been with us for a long time. So whether that's HIV/AIDS, whether it's malaria, but there's really what we're in existence to do is to stop those new outbreaks from becoming epidemics or pandemics. And so we're really focused on that prevention as upstream as possible, and also getting ready, getting countries and organizations and societies ready for that quick response. And I think, we are seeing increasing threats because of the increased threat of pandemic spillover, zoonotic spillover, but also because of climate change. We've seen dengue spread way beyond its usual geographic boundaries. We've seen this huge cholera outbreak recently that has really tested certainly global systems, and the WHO has really had to respond a lot in recent weeks and months on the cholera outbreak. And so we have to realize that the whole landscape of infectious disease is changing all the time. these threats are only going to get more frequent. And so we have to be more prepared. The other thing that we're really keeping our eye on at Pandemic Action Network is the evolution of H5N1. And we have to be really careful with this. We don't want to be scaremongers, but at the same time, H5N1 has been transmitted from different species to different species. There have been human cases. We know it's been a big issue in the US in different herds. If that goes human to human, we're really in a different landscape, and we really have a big problem on our hands. And so we're trying to strike that balance between keeping an eye on it, keeping countries engaged, making sure there's that preparedness without being the scaremongers in the house.
Of course, that makes perfect sense. And sort of what are some of the approaches that Pandemic Action Network takes to this? I know so much of what you do is within, the global health diplomacy work, the coordination amongst civil society and other actors, committees, working groups, et cetera. Could you talk a little bit about how you approach something like this, that you're keeping an eye out for it? And I think we know that COVID will not be the last pandemic. I think everyone's very much agreeing with that. So yeah, just over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we work in different ways. The real strength of our approach is in the network and in the power of the network. We are a small team, but the 400 plus organizations that make up Pandemic Action Network are really our strength and our lifeblood. And what we try to do is to say, look, we know that pandemic prevention and preparedness is not going to be top of everybody's list in civil society, in society. We want to make it as easy as possible for all these groups to advocate on it, to be well prepared on it, to feel that they can speak on these issues with confidence. And so our whole modus operandi is about crowdsourcing from the best expertise available. The beauty of the network is also that we have expertise across a wide range of issues. And then we filter it down, create advocacy tools, and then we can also use that broad network to distribute and make sure we're advocating towards change makers that can put these things into practice. So that's a little bit about how we operate. And I think that approach is more important than ever, given the state that the world is in, with so many different competing big issues craving attention from political leaders. And in terms of how we get our issues forward, it's really different now in mid-2024 than it was at the outset of the COVID pandemic. Obviously, there was this sense in 2020 and in 2021 when Glide joined that we were really in the middle of that new situation, a new situation that the world was dealing with. And all eyes were on COVID, all eyes were on what's the next move that leaders are going to take. That has dissipated almost completely. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia did sort of take the wind out of the sails of the attention on COVID for obvious reasons. People really concerned about this throwback to almost World War II situation. And since then, it's been crisis after crisis. I think that what we try to point out to governments as well is that the roots of the economic crisis that we're in, the sliding back of development, and you could also argue the isolation between countries that actually fermented some of those conflicts around the world, actually have their roots in the COVID pandemic. So there are so many reasons why it's smart to make sure we do not go through that situation again, and that we have to really get through that, what we think is a real psychological barrier to people talking about COVID and taking action on it, because it's something that everybody, whether you're a citizen or a leader, frankly wants to put in the past and wants to forget. And we're saying, let's deal with the lessons that we can learn. Let's make sure we're better prepared for the future, because we absolutely can't drop the ball on this, because my goodness, if we do have a more virulent pandemic in the future, we will really regret that.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, you touched upon, I think, so many of those current challenges that we have, and that we know that all sort of citizens and leaders are operating within, whether that's sort of geopolitical conflict, increasing nationalism. I mean, I think there's something like 64 elections this year, countries going to vote this year, which will have a real impact on the world order and the way that governments and countries approach multilateralism. And I think even within this, though, there is still space and a need for multilateralism. And we saw at the World Health Assembly in May, the international health regulations, the IHR, get approved, but the pandemic treaty still failed to reach consensus. So could you tell us a little bit sort of your thoughts on this, what you think this means for efforts to really come together and reach some sort of global consensus, and how that relates to broader global health security?
Yeah, so it was a tale of two halves at the World Health Assembly. As you said, we had the great news that the international health regulations were passed, and these are really the legal bedrock of progress on pandemic preparedness, rules of the game, if you like, for the world and for each country. So it's brilliant that they were passed, and I think we should take a lot of heart from that. The pandemic agreement had a trickier passage, the good news being that there was this agreement to extend negotiations by hopefully just another year to get it concluded by May 2025. And in July 2024, we've seen the reconstitution of the modalities for the negotiations, so deciding on what the rules will be. We've got Precious Matsoso staying on as a co-chair. We've got a new Marie-Claire Ampoule from France as the other co-chair. So we've got some continuity and some new leadership, and I think a lot of goodwill from all countries to actually get things over the line. One of the reasons that we've been pushing so hard also to get civil society access to the negotiations is that we really feel that as Pandemic Action Network, as part of civil society more broadly, and many of our hundreds of partners, we could be so much more helpful to the process if we were actually in the room. So we'll see if we make progress on that front. It's not just for its own sake. We really want to make sure that we can deliver and be part of those negotiations. But we have a year. There's a stretch goal to deliver by the end of the year. There are sessions being penciled in established for September and November, and potentially an agreement by December. If not, it will run through to next year. So we remain hopeful, but we are clear-eyed about what kind of work it will take, and we want to be there to help countries to do that.
Thanks, Eloise. I mean, another year when I know there's obviously a lot of work that's already gone into getting us to the stage that we are at now. Do you think that there's the risk that we're going to run into fatigue from the member states themselves who are negotiating this? Or does there really seem to be that collective will and desire to see this through to the end and actually have an agreed treaty at the end of this process?
I think the mood in May was really a rush towards the finish line, and also the kind of closing remarks from many of the different stakeholders. There really was the goodwill to get that over the line. I do think that has to translate, to be real, that also has to translate into some of the bigger blocks and some of the richer blocks, frankly, that have the rules of the game skewed in their favor at the moment. They have to be prepared to give more away, to actually understand that you can't go on public stages and say, no one's safe till everyone's safe. We must have an equitable future, but then not budge in your position that's really formulated around national interest. And I think the bit that we need to crack collectively, and particularly as civil society, is this notion and this reality that actually, if we had cooperation at the international level during COVID, if we'd have had a more strategic deployment of tests, vaccines, treatments throughout the pandemic, we would have actually all gotten out of the pandemic earlier. And there is scientific modeling to prove this without a doubt. But this kind of hoarding that we saw from the rich countries and this buying 8 to 10 times the vaccine that you need. This clear kind of two-level system that we had. No wonder countries in low and middle income countries have pushed back against that. And the kind of tweaking at the edges that is often proposed as a response to what we learned during COVID doesn't seem to get the fundamental idea that it's pretty disparaging to low middle income countries to say, all right, then we'll just give you a bit more by charity and not level set the structural rules of the game. And secondly, this idea that ultimately it would be in all of our self-interest to actually have a strategy that is more regional and global in nature than we had during COVID.
That's so interesting. I mean, I recall back to 2021, which feels like ages ago now, when everyone was saying, well, now this is the point where everyone is going to see the importance of global health, that diseases truly know no borders or no boundaries. And I think because of some of the challenges that you've said and sort of the context in which we find ourselves, that's really not been the case. If anything, it's sort of now on the back burner. And we've got all these replenishments coming up as well for Gavi and the Global Fund. There's just so much happening in the global health and development space. But thinking about, the pandemic treaty and looking at global health security, I mean, so many of these things are rooted, I think, in what you said around the isolation that stemmed from COVID, and wondering, how you think we can utilize perhaps some of the communication campaigns and narratives to build that demand for a more coordinated, collaborative approach, whether that's through populations calling on their governments or whatever that might look like.
Yeah, I think the lessons from COVID from the kind of civil society point of view and from a pandemic action network point of view are manyfold, but the one that I sort of carry with me the whole time is I almost can't believe that we ever thought at any time that an organization can change the weather. The idea of working collaboratively and trying to really crowdsource and pull in the energy and expertise and brilliance and contact points and communications points with citizens, with leaders that we have done during COVID and now into that post-COVID period as we work on pandemic prevention and preparedness is absolutely critical. And so as we now look to work on related issues, such as the impact of climate, such as leveraging the finance opportunities internationally, it's more important than ever that we all pull in the same direction. So I do think that organizing collaboratively with these small nodes of sort of secretariat function to be at the service of the broader community is absolutely the way forward. We won't win as a civil society movement on these kinds of issues if we are competing with each other. We have to leverage each other and lift each other up to say, actually, here's the expert you should be talking to. This person is the best at talking to you on this. Here's how we can support you in your work in this report that you've written, rather than the kind of old-fashioned competitive frame of why are they doing better, we need to get ahead. I think that those were the days of a kind of luxury where our issues were baked in many countries and there was tacit, broad support. We're in a different game right now. Politics is changing all the time. You mentioned earlier the fact we have so many elections this year. Where I sit here in Brussels, there's been a lot of kind of existential reckoning after the European elections in June, which opened up the French elections at the end of June and early July. And then we've had a change of government in the UK and also the rise of a brand new party that went from 0 to take 15% of the vote, which is seen as being to the far right. So the electoral context is changing so much. We have to stay ahead of that and we have to stay hyper connected to support each other on this range of issues to make sure we're as smart and strategic as possible.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, I feel like we could keep going here, but I think we're almost nearing the end of this episode today, and it's really meant to be just a taste of the topic. So what I wanted to do was invite you to provide just a few reflections as we close out, sort of what your hopes are when we look ahead over the next year to even year to 5 years, as we look to the 2030 deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals, and where you would like to see us as a collective in global health and development when it comes to the security angle.
Thank you. So my dreams for the next few years, well, in the immediate term, I hope we make amazing progress on antimicrobial resistance in September. This is another issue that needs whole of society, whole of government approaches, just like with pandemic prevention. My dream for the longer term is that we don't see either global health or pandemic prevention in small silos, but understand that investing in these things makes economic sense, makes human capital sense, and also is absolutely the right thing to do if we want to avoid these kind of disastrous situations that we know are coming down the track. We know we can get ahead of them, so why on earth wouldn't we? And I want us to see governments understanding that international threats are just as much about the impact at home. So let's not always see spending internationally as some kind of luxury item. Actually, we need to be spending more on systems all across the world, because if no one's safe until everyone's safe, we absolutely need a gold standard of surveillance, of reaction, of response, of healthcare for everybody all across the world, which will help all of us at home. So that line between domestic and international spending needs to blur in the other direction. For too long, we've taken international money and invested it at home. We need to do it the other way around, because that's the future. Interconnection is our future. Collaboration is our future. And my dream is that we all work together across different issues to make the most positive change happen.
Thank you so much, Eloise. That's a really nice sort of uplifting way to end an episode, because I started thinking as you were speaking, of all these different angles that are all linked, and you sort of talk global health security and you break it down into all these different pieces. We didn't even talk about AMR and antimicrobial resistance, but that's such a big piece of it. And we didn't really touch the climate change element, because that will be another episode of the podcast later this year. But I think it's really important to start out this discussion of how all these elements are linked, and the importance of collaboration and collective efforts. Because as you said, we're not safe until all of us are. So thank you so much for joining us, Eloise. It's been a real pleasure. We'll make sure to also direct our listeners and viewers to the Pandemic Action Network's website, where there are a host and multitude of resources and ways to get in touch with folks at the network as well. So thank you so much for joining us, Eloise.
Thank you so much, Priya. It's been an absolute pleasure.